Welcome to Hazard Communication and Global Harmonization System Training. For this particular module, we will be addressing the new 16-section format for the safety data sheets. And as we have done before in the other modules, I'd like to direct your attention to objective number 1, or the first bullet point that you see, which says to introduce the major hazard communication changes to the course participant. Being that the new 16-section format is a significant change to the hazard communication regulations, this is the primary objective that we're going to accomplish in this module. So what we aim to do in this particular module is to very briefly go over the 16-digit format. The purpose of this endeavor is to introduce each participant to these standardized sections that contain information that you can see clearly on your screen now. And so I want to point out a couple of things. Firstly, if you look at sections 1 through 11 and 16, these are the sections that are going to pertain to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. Now, not under OSHA's jurisdiction would be sections 12, 13, 14, and 15, which primarily pertain to the Department of Transportation, or DOT, and Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, standards. So you might think that those wouldn't apply to your workplace, but you would be wrong. So that's why we're going to go through each one of these 16 sections just to introduce you to what to expect with respect to each section. So let's go ahead and go into section number 1 on identification of a substance. So what we're speaking of here is, as a quick review, every chemical used in the workplace has to have a safety data sheet. And due to the new requirements nationwide, we've gone to this global system, this GHS system, that is supposed to standardize a safety data sheet globally. And so each one of these sections is going to pertain to a given chemical. And so this is a real big benefit for many employees, because if we want to say, okay, where can we identify the substance, it's always going to be the first section. Or if we want to know where to find firefighting information, for example, we know that that's in section 5. So identification of substance in section 1 is going to contain things like your Global Harmonization System, or GHS, product identifier, other means of identification like a trade name or chemical name, chemical uses restrictions, the supplier details and manufacturer's information, and sometimes we'll get an emergency phone number for the manufacturer, or possibly Chemtrack or another agency. Moving on to section 2, section 2 is going to pertain to hazards identification. GHS classification of a substance or mixture and the national or regional information is going to be contained here. We are going to also see label elements like precautionary statements. We're going to see hazard statements. We might see some of the GHS pictograms, such as the skull and crossbones, as we have covered in the other module. And so that's what you can find in section 2. Moving on to section 3, we're going to look at composition and information on ingredients. And so this is primarily going to pertain to mixtures, and a good example is you think about Lysol, the most common disinfectant that most people use in their homes and at some businesses. And you'll notice that some of the ingredients to Lysol is going to be some type of alcohol, usually ethanol with a perfume or fragrance. Other chemicals will have stabilizers, they will have perhaps solvents, and so mixtures are always important, especially under the new GHS standards. So we really want to look at the chemical identity and the composition of a chemical, because there may be some additional chemicals that we would perhaps need to address in a training, or we want to communicate that a particular chemical is a carcinogen or teratogen, as one example. Moving on to first aid measures, section 4. This section is pretty common. It's pretty down to earth for most people to understand. However, I do want to note here with first aid in section 4, the time to look at first aid measures isn't when there's a first aid incident. It's not when an employee gets hurt or spills a chemical on his arm or skin or something like that. We always want to look at first aid measures prior to using a chemical, and if it's been a while, we always want to brush up on that and make sure that we recognize any acute or chronic symptoms or effects and see what we need to do to protect ourselves if we come into contact with the chemical. So first aid measures can be found in section 4. It's a really good section to be thoroughly knowledgeable in. Moving on, as I mentioned a few moments ago, section 5 pertains to firefighting measures. Now, many chemicals used in various industries are going to be flammable or combustible, and we see that in the workplace there usually are class A, B, C fire extinguishers spread throughout the building, and we need to be able to classify a type of fire based on the chemical composition. So for example, some chemicals, if they may be flammable, and if they come into contact with an ignition source, they may give off another gas that could make firefighting measures very difficult. So firefighting is not always a simple process. It's not always cut and dried. We need to know if special personal protective equipment or other precautions are necessary. And any of this information is always going to be found in the newly standardized Section 5 on firefighting measures. Moving on to Section 6, accidental release measures. Okay. In this particular section, what we are looking at is the difference between perhaps a large spill of a substance and a small spill. For example, some chemicals must be cleaned up in a certain way. They must be addressed in a certain way to prevent environmental issues. And so the methods, materials, best practices on containment, and general information on cleaning up a particular chemical can be found in Section 6. Let us move on now to Section 7, handling and storage. Handling and storage is probably one of the most overlooked portions or sections in the traditional material safety data sheet, and I hope that's not the case with the new safety data sheets. But without fail, I go and do site visits at different locations and different facilities all the time, and it's very common for different companies to store oxidizers right next to fuels. It's very common to have flammable and combustible liquids stored near ignition sources. And so this particular section addresses how a chemical is supposed to be stored. In addition to that, how is it supposed to be transferred? For example, we know that if we looked at, say, methanol or methyl alcohol, we would want to ground a 55-gallon drum in order to prevent static electricity from becoming an ignition source in that particular chemical. So these are types of examples that you could possibly look out for in the workplace. So every chemical needs to be stored in an appropriate way, and it needs to be handled in an appropriate way to prevent any kind of fire hazard or explosion hazard or any other type of hazard. Section 8 pertains to exposure controls and personal protection. Exposure controls and personal protection are going to identify appropriate engineering controls. Engineering controls, work practices or administrative control measures, and personal protective equipment are all three the primary OSHA control measures that we're supposed to implement in the workplace. And so if ventilation, for example, an engineering control measure, is required for a particular chemical used in a confined space, like a certain kind of oil-based paint or paint thinner, we might look at what the manufacturer states in Section 8 in order to abide by any ventilation requirements or air change requirements for spaces. So that's an example there that you might look at. Section 8 is going to concern all kinds of information about exposure limit values, biological limit values, and any other control measures that are wisely implemented. Section 9 is going to outline the chemical's physical and chemical properties. And the reason this information is very valuable is we look at it all the time. Okay, so if we see something and the pH is 2.1, we know that that is a strong acid, and we can address that appropriately. We look at vapor density, for example, and compare that to air density, and that lets us know whether or not chemical fumes or vapors will be likely to sink to the ground and settle in low-lying areas or rise to the ceiling levels. So this information is very valuable for determining how a chemical is likely to behave, and it gives us a good insight into what we can expect, and it also allows us to come up with the most appropriate measures in using the chemical, handling the chemical, storing the chemical, and also cleanup if we have a spill, whether that's a large or small spill. It's all good information. Moving on to Section 10, Stability and Reactivity. As many of you might remember, if you've had a chemistry course, water and metallic potassium don't mix. In fact, there's a very violent reaction when water comes into contact with metals such as potassium. And so not all materials are going to be stored well. They don't play nice with others. For example, we know that strong acids like hydrochloric acid will have a violent and volatile reaction with a strong base like sodium hydroxide. So this section, Section 10, is going to give information to the reader about incompatible materials, chemical stability, and what types of reactions you could expect or reasonably expect. Okay, so this information is going to clarify that kind of procedure and allow you to prevent any incident or accident to employees. Section 11 is highly important to every employee in the workplace. Toxicological information found in Section 11 is going to outline the health effects to individuals who are exposed to the chemical. And as a reminder, I want to outline the 4 ways or 4 routes of entry for chemicals and how they get in the body, and they are inhalation, ingestion, absorption or contact, you'll see that both ways, and injection. And I believe that was covered in another module, so I just want to review it here, and that way you can put into perspective the information from Section 11 on a safety data sheet. Another important thing to remember as you consider the routes of entry into the body is I want you to consider how some chemicals have acute effects or they have chronic effects. And so, for example, toluene has acute inhalation effects, whereby if an employee inhales too much of that vapor, the chemical will attack the central nervous system and act as a depressant. And so what we want to do is we want to look at this information to see how a chemical is going to impact the body both in the short term and in the long term. And we also want to know if a chemical causes cancer or is a carcinogen, has any reproductive impacts such as teratogens do. And we want to make sure we avoid mutagens because they're closely related to carcinogens. And this information basically gives us a great outline of that kind of information, which is very, very useful to all of us who want to avoid getting sick in the long term. Section 12 is going to be ecological information. It's going to cover things like adverse environmental effects, bioaccumulative potential. For example, one particular chemical, PCBs, you might have heard that, or polychlorinated bipheноls, that has a great deal of bioaccumulative potential. And so we want to make sure that we follow the rules in Section 12 if they're outlined there, and so we understand the environmental impact. Section 13, disposal considerations, is going to pertain to how to get rid of waste and hazardous materials that may be collected or stored over a chemical's use. And so disposal considerations are always important. I do want to make an important note here that the safety data sheets will likely not include local or state regulatory information, and so if a municipality or a county has specific disposal requirements for certain types of chemicals, you must always comply with those regulations that are likely to supersede those of the federal government. Moving on to Section 14, transport information. This is going to have a UN number. It's going to have shipping names, transport hazard classes if that's applicable. We're now going to require, marine pollutants to be logged and categorized in more depth. That's a bigger change that we're seeing enforced over time now. And any other information that pertains to transport. So this seems to be 100% a Department of Transportation type requirement. And so you can obviously see the background there. And we might see international transport information on some safety data sheets as well from other countries that are either imported or exported via a shipping port of some sort. Section 15 is regulatory information, and so this is going to have information that is regulatory in nature. I put a couple of examples up on the screen here. Both are derived from the Environmental Protection Agency. For example, there are certain requirements under the TSCA and RCRA, or Toxic Substance Control Act and Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, respectively. So other regulatory information is going to be found in Section 15. It's going to be very helpful to look at that from time to time, but this section will probably be ignored for the majority of employers unless they actually need to seek out this information for some purpose. Section 16, as we get closer to wrapping up here, can be anything else. If they didn't cover it in the first 15 sections, or if we find a way to invent a new chemical that we haven't really appropriately addressed, we might find that information stuck in Section 16. So as a good practice, as you go through your workplace and try to become more and more familiar with the chemicals in the workplace, I would look at Section 16 of a safety data sheet just to see what's there. I wouldn't be surprised to see that some manufacturers might put sales information down. They might put a few supplementary things, and I would be interested to see if a manufacturer hides anything. Some manufacturers are infamous for putting footnotes or saying in one section that a chemical is a non-carcinogen, but then in another section stating that it's a known carcinogen. So we've seen some conflicts before. So Section 16 is kind of important in that way. You just want to see what they're putting down in that section. And if you determine that it's not of much use, then you can move on. But you might be surprised at what you find here. And that is probably going to be the most varied section out of the 16 section format. So as we get closer to ending here, let's go ahead and review. We briefly went through the 16 section format of the new safety data sheet requirement. And I want to make a hint to you. If you go to your workplace and you see that you have a material safety data sheet binder, some people call it a right to know binder, check to see what's in there. If you see a chemical that says material safety data sheet, you know right away that that's likely outdated, and what I would do is contact that particular manufacturer and see if you can get a safety data sheet. A lot of times you can pull these right off of the company's website. Other times I'm finding here recently that some companies don't have them ready yet, and so keep that in mind. As always, with the other sections, if you have any questions, feel free to call me, email me. I'd be happy to help.